It is the comparison we have all been waiting for. KTM 390 SMC R versus the Suzuki DR-Z4SM. What can they do? What do you get for your money? We'll find out in this video. Stay tuned. And with that, a very warm welcome to 1000 PS TV. Martin and I were out today with the new A2 Supermotos, on the one hand from KTM, on the other from Suzuki. Finally they are here. We have waited for them for a long time. Let us put these bikes into context right from the beginning. Starting with the KTM. We all know it is based on the 390 Duke, so it is really more of a naked bike dressed up as a supermoto. Meanwhile, the Suzuki DR-Z4SM is the reissue of the legendary DR-Z400, now adapted for Euro 5 and with a couple of electronic updates and gimmicks. But if you want to know more about the details of these bikes, dear Martin has already made individual videos for each bike. KTM 390 SMC R and Suzuki DR-Z4SM, both on country roads and on the Supermoto track. Which means for all the technical details, please click the videos down in the description. We are focusing today on the comparison, on the riding impressions, both on the road and on the Supermoto track. At the same time, I also want to put us a little bit into context. Let me start with myself, dear Martin. I am more the hobby Supermoto guy. Every now and then I get one under my legs, and I am happy, of course, to ride these nimble and lively bikes. But Martin, I think in this comparison you are more of the expert when it comes to supermotos. You also ride quite a lot of supermoto privately.
Yes, I own a supermoto privately, a Hypermoto 698. With that I ride relatively often on track and on country roads. But the last few weeks, thanks to you guys, because I got to test all these bikes, I actually got to ride more than in the whole of last year. And I found it really exciting today that we actually had both bikes at the same time in the test. And we could swap back and forth between track and road. Because then you really notice the differences immediately. Differences you cannot really pick up from the spec sheet or from the data sheets the way you actually feel them in reality.
So you hear it, we have an experienced supermoto rider here and me more as a beginner. But I think for this comparison that is just right. We may not manage to drift into corners sideways, like in the marketing material of these two manufacturers, but I think the target group of these bikes is exactly this kind of person. Someone who wants to enter the world of supermoto, or someone who is looking for a second bike to have some fun with on the road or the supermoto track. Before we get to the track, I want to mention the most obvious difference. I actually asked you on the YouTube community tab, what do you want to know about these bikes? I could have spared myself the question because the main question was, why is the Suzuki so expensive? Yes, the price difference is relatively huge if we look at Austrian prices. 7,000 euro for the KTM, almost 10,000 euro for the Suzuki. That is 3,000 euro difference. Why exactly Suzuki decided to price it that way, we cannot answer. But maybe we can tell you whether it is worth putting 3,000 euro more into the Suzuki or whether you should rather go for the KTM. For fair comparability, I also want to mention our tires, because before we started today, we fitted the Conti SM2 on both machines. ContiAttack SM2, Martin, I already heard you talking about them earlier. What can you tell us about the tires?
Well, the ContiAttack SM2 is actually a racetrack tire that has road approval, which means you can use it for everyday riding on the street. You just need to be a bit careful if it rains heavily or it is ice cold. But when the temperatures are mild like today, then you get great everyday performance. But the real ace up its sleeve is with sporty riding, sporty touring or on the track, because it has enormous hot grip. And if you have a light bike, like for example our Supermotos here, you can almost ride it like a slick. Once it is warmed up after a few laps, you can go full throttle and do not really need to think about the tire anymore.
I totally agree. I already rode this tire last year on the big Supermotos. And when I saw that Conti now also offers it for these small new A2 Supermotos, well, I immediately made a phone call. So thanks to Conti for being so kind and sending us the tires quickly so we had fair test conditions. We did have, I should still mention, a little problem in the form of a screw in the rear tire of the Suzuki. But our local connections managed to get the Suzuki back on the road for us, so we had a fair comparison today. So let's start talking about the bikes, and we'll begin with the cheaper one, the KTM. What were your impressions with it today?
This is already my second time with the KTM on the Supermoto track. Today I felt even better than the first time. The first time it was all new to me. So today it was even more fun. And one has to be honest, it is called Supermoto. It looks like a Supermoto. But there are a few details that make it not really a pure Supermoto, but rather a naked bike in a Supermoto outfit. First of all, the suspension travel, it is relatively short. That is totally fine if you are riding on the road, and even on the Supermoto track it is completely fine. Only if you really plan to jump over dirt hills, then I could imagine that the suspension travel would probably be too short and you might bottom out or hit something underneath. But honestly, I do not think anyone will really try to do a proper full-on Supermoto race with this bike. That is the first point. The second point that stands out is the tank design. It is a bit like the Enduro or the Duke. It has this hump on the road that is totally fine because you sit a bit further back anyway. Absolutely no problem. But on the Supermoto track, you would actually love to move way up onto the front wheel. And that, unfortunately, the tank prevents. You cannot get far enough forward. And when you brake hard on the front before a corner, then you just do not get enough weight onto the front wheel to really get into a proper slide, unless your name is Lukas Höll or you are another pro. But for an average rider, the seating position makes it a bit harder if you want to ride in proper Supermoto style. Yes, and if you stretch your foot forward, then you notice also with the handlebar, because it is relatively low, that you might even bump into it a bit. So if you ride this bike like a naked bike, all perfect. If you try hardcore Supermoto riding, then the ergonomics and design just have a few limits. Yes, that is the case with the KTM. With the Suzuki, it is quite different.
Exactly. I also want to add one or two words on the KTM, because I find this description, naked bike in Supermoto dress, actually quite fitting, even if at first I found it a bit insulting towards KTM. Because finally KTM has brought out a 390 Supermoto, and then people say, yeah, it is really just a naked bike, not a real Supermoto. But when you ride it, you really do feel the connection to the Duke. As you correctly said, the tank that rises up and the low handlebar, they just do not give you that pure Supermoto feeling. But I think for the target group of this bike, mainly young riders who will mostly use it on the road, it is just right, because you are not lost on the Supermoto track either. Of course, if a real Supermoto appears in your rearview mirror, then you better make space. But if you just want to take your first steps on the track or spend a couple of hours riding in circles, then the ergonomic setup of the 390 SMC R is actually very accessible. That means I would honestly put any A2 rider on it and say, do a few laps. Because it is so safely designed that you can hardly do anything wrong. Switch into sport mode, activate the Supermoto ABS, and then you can even let the rear wheel lock a bit. But we spent the whole day today on the track with Supermoto ABS, and I never once ended up in a dangerous situation. The setup is really accessible, and for that reason I think the 390 SMC R is actually not so badly placed on the Supermoto track if you know you are there to have fun, not to break lap records. You just want to dip your toes into the Supermoto world. You should definitely stay on the asphalt track, and if there are any jumps, in my opinion, you should just leave them out. But speaking of jumps, we did not jump today, Martin, but you were talking about jumps the whole time. The DR-Z could probably handle that better, right?
Well, I personally cannot jump. I would not even try, because then we would have one test bike less. But just from the way it is built, it is basically the Enduro. The suspension travel is much longer. We do not have an exhaust header running under the engine, but instead a skid plate with a frame underneath. Which means, in my opinion, this bike is a hardcore Supermoto bike. And also with the riding position, with the plastic tank that lets you slide really far forward, plus plenty of space under the handlebar for your legs, with this bike you can definitely do everything you could do with the big Supermotos. And on top of that, you have the advantage that it is very light.
On the Supermoto track, what struck me immediately was the difference in engines. If you only look at the power figures, the KTM has 45 horsepower and 38 Newton meters of torque. And the Suzuki has 38 horsepower and 37 Newton meters of torque. So technically it is weaker. But already from the very first meter you notice that the Suzuki engine pushes much harder from the bottom than the KTM engine. You can rev it out too, sure, but this classic single cylinder feeling, that low down grunt, the Suzuki delivers that. The only downside with this engine is that you cannot order a quick shifter, not even as an accessory. You could send all your money to Suzuki and they would still not bolt a quick shifter onto the 5-speed gearbox.
Yes, that is such a pity. It is probably an even bigger pity for people who ride on the country road or in the city than it is on the racetrack. Because on the racetrack, well, maybe you have to stretch out a bit more and also reach for the clutch. The Suzuki does actually have its own special clutch in there. It is not a real slipper clutch, but it works like a slipper clutch. It is called SCAS. And it works so well, despite being cable operated, that on the racetrack, when you brake harder into corners and all the weight is on the front wheel and apparently the whole drivetrain is relieved, you can really shift down and the rear wheel simply does not lock up. Unless, of course, you switch off the ABS with the push of a button, then you can naturally also get the rear wheel to chatter, to lock, to squeal, just the way you know it. But basically, on the racetrack, when downshifting, there is absolutely no problem with the fact that there is no quick shifter. But when you ride, let us say, a bit more briskly on the country road, or when you want to cruise, especially with this engine, I want to come back again to the fact that it already works so well at low revs. Not only does it pull strongly from down low, it also runs silky smooth, a very smooth character. That makes real sense also for cruising. And in that situation, you would maybe wish that without much pressure on the front wheel or without high revs, you could just flick through the gears with your left foot, simply without using the clutch. Unfortunately, with normal soft riding, that just does not work.
From my point of view, it is definitely the more serious Supermoto. It follows that concept more consistently. But one really has to say, honestly, I had a harder time with it today than with the KTM, simply because the ergonomics are clearly more aggressive in the direction of a real Supermoto stance. The handlebar is higher, it comes more towards me. And because I have a short upper body and short legs, whenever I sat all the way forward, I always had the feeling that the handlebar was right up at my chin. And I do not know if that is just my inexperience in the Supermoto world, but if someone is maybe looking for more of an all-rounder bike, then you should definitely spend more time riding the DR-Z to see whether it really suits your riding style at all.
Regarding the Supermoto track, I just want to say one thing. I do not know that many tracks, but I do know a few. And the track here in Bad Fischau is really first class. We have consistently good asphalt. We do not have any bumps in it. There is just one small ripple, and that is it. Which means that all the suspension travel the Suzuki actually offers, you do not need that here at all. The suspension of the KTM is tuned very stiff, and on this racetrack it works excellently. If you now go to a different racetrack where maybe the asphalt is constantly changing, where there is gravel, dirt, bumps in the surface, then I do believe that in such a case the suspension of the Suzuki would suit the track more, and you might have an easier time on those rougher tracks with the Suzuki, because the suspension reacts a bit more comfortably compared to the hard, stiff, road-focused suspension of the KTM.
I think we have talked enough now about the Supermoto track. These bikes, A2 bikes under 48 horsepower, clearly placed in the entry-level category. They will be ridden mainly on the country road and in everyday life, and there we were also able to gather quite a bit of experience. I would say let us start just like before with the KTM.
We have 6 gears, we have a really strong engine that pulls from the mid-range all the way to the top. And for everyone who likes to rev out the gears and really, yes, ride with power, with the KTM they will not necessarily have it easy, but they can really enjoy it because on the country road it is truly a rocket. The suspension, as we already said, is adjustable. Everything is top and also very firm, but not excessively firm. So it just fits right out of the box. And the electronics, they also work super well. You go into street mode, leave the ABS fully on, traction control too. You can play around with it a little depending on which tires you have, or you leave it in the middle setting. And really, with the new electronics installed here, you can hardly do anything wrong. But also, yes, Open the throttle, have fun. It is a real dream on the country road. And for my taste, it is really fast. I honestly would not have thought that a 390 could be this sharp, the way it just marched through the switchbacks we rode today. So sharp and precise. Really cool.
I actually cannot add much more to that. Just maybe one positive and one negative point that stood out to me with the KTM in everyday riding. On the positive side, in this price range, you get adjustable levers straight from the factory. The Suzuki, for example, does not offer me that. But what struck me more negatively in everyday riding and on the country road is the high level of vibrations from this motorcycle. Of course, one could say it is a single cylinder, it is supposed to vibrate, it is supposed to rattle. I am completely on board with that. But unfortunately, the KTM has such high frequency vibrations when riding at a constant speed that over longer periods of time, it does get relatively unpleasant.
Next point, the seat of the KTM is excellent. In my opinion, it even offers comfort for longer distances. And on top of that, you also have the foot pegs, which are adjustable in height. That means the knee angle, which is already quite relaxed as standard, could be made even more relaxed if you want that. Of course, you give up some ground clearance in exchange. And what also became clear today on the racetrack is this. If you ride the exact same corner at roughly the same speed with both bikes, then with the KTM you do end up touching down with the foot pegs earlier than with the Suzuki, despite the suspension travel. Which means because of the longer suspension travel, the Suzuki's foot pegs sit a little higher, but in return, the knee angle on the Suzuki is noticeably tighter. So over longer rides on the country road, I think it could maybe be a bit harder on you in terms of seating position because you sit a little more cramped than on the KTM.
I agree with you there. If we want to continue now with the Suzuki, the seat, a proper Supermoto seat, looks great, but comfort is another story. It is very narrow and the padding does not promise much long distance comfort. So we did not ride long stretches today, and even then we already thought, yes, you have to be tough, you have to want that. But otherwise, I honestly want to give credit to the Suzuki, because the main criticism of this engine is not only the price, but also the 5-speed gearbox. And now, riding it here today on the country road, you can probably tell us a bit about the gearing. But when I am rolling along at around 100 kilometers per hour, which is how I ride on the country road, because of course I do not ride faster than that on the road, blah blah, it did not strike me as particularly negative that there are only 5 gears. Because the high frequency vibrations that are present in the KTM are simply not there on this motorcycle. Suzuki has balanced that very nicely with this single cylinder engine, so you can ride relatively vibration free. And then even at 130 kilometers per hour, yes, it probably becomes more critical in terms of fuel consumption. But even the KTM is already at a relatively high rev level in 6th gear, so the fact that the Suzuki has only 5 gears did not strike me as particularly negative.
Yes, I was actually more scared when I read about it than I was in reality. First gear is a little longer than usual. Gears 2, 3 and 4 on the other hand are very short. That means if you are moving in that range, I don't know, up to 100, 120 kilometers per hour, you might find yourself shifting fairly often. But from 100, 120 kilometers per hour and up, you stay in 5th gear, and yes, then it just goes. On the highway, I could imagine it might be a little inconvenient, but in truth, who rides this bike straight at 160 kilometers per hour for hours on end? Yes, then maybe a 6th gear would not be bad. But for normal riding, it really works perfectly fine.
Now let's move on to one of our last chapters, namely the electronics. What do you get for your money? In this regard, the KTM has actually set a pretty high standard in this class, because it comes with a brand new TFT display. Gone are the small LC displays that you used to see on Supermotos. This is really quite modern now.
Yes, that is actually perfect in my opinion, and I hope that the larger SMC R will also get such a display, or at least the same display, because it really covers everything. It is easy to read, the tachometer bar is great, and the control via this joystick is totally intuitive. You can adjust quite a lot in the electronics, riding modes, traction control, ABS and Supermoto mode. That is a bit much, but I think if you only ride on the country road, you set it up once, maybe switch to rain mode occasionally, and that's it. it offers a lot of options. You do have to familiarize yourself with it a bit, but fundamentally, in terms of how it presents itself, how you can control it and how it works, the blipper, the traction control, the ABS, it all just works really perfectly.
Unfortunately, with the KTM, that the quick shifter with blipper is an extra cost option, but at least you have the choice. And I think we agree on this. Absolute recommendation to get the quick shifter. Best to order it right away. With the blipper, you really can't go wrong with KTM. They do it well. What surprised me on the 390 is that we not only have a water temperature display, but if you scroll through the menu, you can even check the oil temperature. And that is actually quite rare in this A2 class, to know exactly when the oil is at the right temperature and viscosity, so you can really attack it properly. Now, if we look over at the Suzuki, which is 3,000 euros more expensive, yes, it's a bit more Spartan. You might think, yes, it's old school, like in the old days. Honestly, the key even looks like that. I don't know, it doesn't exactly inspire owner pride in me. And the display is also rather old school. We have LC indicators. They are easy to read and cover the essentials, so to speak. But really luxurious or beautiful, I don't think it is.
Yes, it serves its purpose. It doesn't have a torque display. You don't strictly need one, but it wouldn't be bad if it were included. The gear indicator is there, which I think is great, as it wasn't available before. Yes, there are a few other details that personally bother me a little. For example, the ABS, when you want to turn it off, is called off-road ABS off. And the traction control mode for the racetrack is actually called G mode for gravel. So it's obvious that the Enduro and the Supermoto use the same display, and I don't quite understand that because it's just an off-road mode and you don't make two different off-road modes. But otherwise, it serves its purpose. Legibility is okay. And the way the individual levels are divided, level 2, 1 for the country road traction control, then the gravel or racetrack traction control, or completely off, that makes sense, it's logical, and 4 levels in total are really enough. You don't need the 8 to 18 levels that some manufacturers offer.
You can also adjust the power modes, ABC, as is already known from Suzuki, but that's basically it for this display. You can scroll through the trip meter using the control buttons on the handlebar. You can also view the battery voltage, but aside from that, unfortunately, Suzuki doesn't offer much in terms of equipment here. Which is why I would also say, Martin, that it's time we slowly move on to a conclusion. Is the Suzuki 3,000 euros better than the KTM in your opinion?
So in my eyes, you really have to say this bluntly, the KTM in a direct comparison actually has a fantastic price to performance ratio. The Suzuki seems expensive. Overpriced? I don't know. Expensive? Yes. I also thought for a long time about how you could maybe spin it positively, and I actually came up with something. Because according to Suzuki, when they build something, it's built to last. Everything is carefully considered. There's nothing in it that can easily break. I mean, anything can break, of course, but the components of the engine and so on are made for long-term durability. And if they really manage that with the engine and the transmission, then that's already a huge advantage. So if I were to buy the bike now, and I'm sure I want to ride Supermoto, want to practice, want to learn, then out of these two bikes, only the Suzuki would really remain. And then I could also come to terms with the 3,000 euro difference, because in a few years, that difference evens out over time if I have fewer repairs or no repairs at all, and the resale value will also remain higher. So in the end, everything is a bit relative.
That's a good point. Resale value. I checked what an old DR-Z would cost. A 20-year-old DR-Z400 Supermoto. 20 years old, God knows how many kilometers, probably gone through at least 5 owners. They still cost around 5,000 to 6,000 euros in Austria. That's half the price of a new one, which hasn't been torn up by anyone, hasn't been crashed by anyone. So compared to a used one, it's actually a pretty good deal. But I agree with you, if you look at the price tags between KTM and Suzuki, personally I find it too expensive. When I first saw it in the brochure, I thought, oh my God, that's the bike. Especially in that beautiful white paint with the blue anodized rims. I would love to park that in my garage. But when I think about the fact that I mostly ride on the road, personally, and maybe occasionally, if it's every 2 weeks, hit the Supermoto track to do a few fast laps, then I'd be much happier with the KTM because I saved 3,000 euros and I have a bike that works really well on the road, is practical for everyday use, and also offers me better equipment, all at a lower price. I really want to like the Suzuki. I had hoped that today I'd leave here and say, go ahead, spend 10,000 euros on it, But unfortunately, compared to the KTM, I just can't do that.
But if you're a Suzuki fanboy, and I know a few in my circle who are, then if you have the money, you can go for it without any hesitation. Because honestly, with this bike, you really can't go wrong. And the quick shifter, eventually the quick shifter will come. I'm sure of that.
Martin, in the end, I can only thank you for coming out here with me today, for enduring the hassles we had with the Suzuki's rear tire. But shit happens. You can't say it any other way. So now it's over to you. What do you think about these two motorcycles? Would this crossover Supermoto, the KTM 93 SMC R, be enough for you? Or would it have to be the DR-Z4SM? Would you spend 10,000 euros on it? Write your thoughts in the comments. I've already read that people want to debate this, so go ahead and do it here in this video. Down in the comments, just write your opinion. Of course, let's also give a thumbs up to Jakob behind the camera and Cookie as well behind the camera. And with that, we thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video. Leave a thumbs up. See you soon. Bye. Ciao.